Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a profoundly serious and honestly a pretty devastating topic: the massive gap between what the child welfare system is legally mandated to do and what's actually happening on the ground. We're going to be looking at some extensive source documentation from a mother's harrowing legal battle with the Department of Children and Family Services, or DCFS, and really interestingly, how that exact crisis birthed a completely revolutionary technological response.
Okay, let's quickly hit our roadmap for this explainer. We'll be covering 1. The broken welfare promise. 2. Violations of due process. 3. Silencing the most vulnerable. 4. AI as the unbiased listener. And 5. Reclaiming justice through tech.
Section 1. The broken welfare promise. The gap between mandate and reality. So let's start with a foundational legal concept called parens patriae. It sounds very academic, but it's basically the legal principle that establishes the state's absolute, built-in duty to protect its most vulnerable citizens. We're talking specifically about children here. When a state agency like DCFS steps in, they are formally acting as the state's agent in that protective role. This mandate isn't a suggestion, right? It's the baseline expectation we have as a society when human institutions intervene in our family lives. But according to the sources, there is a really stark juxtaposition between that intended mission of family preservation and the documented operational reality. Instead of protection, the documentation alleges deliberate family separation, obscured facts, and just paralyzing bureaucratic failure. The materials we're examining today suggest a severe systemic breakdown, where the very agencies tasked with keeping families together are accused of actively tearing them apart through operational misconduct. Moving on to Section 2. Violations of due process, the anatomy of institutional failure. Based on the source material, the mother in this case study documented over 40 distinct civil rights violations. And we're not talking about minor clerical errors here. We're talking about fundamental due process failures. Things like the right to simply be notified about what's happening to your own child, the right to truth and freedom from defamation by state agents, and of course, the fundamental right to maintain family bonds. This is absolutely crucial, because when state agents bypass these basic rights, the entire protective system just collapses, leaving everyday citizens completely defenseless against institutional overreach. The sources map out a really troubling timeline here, suggesting a systematic pattern of intentional obfuscation. Imagine this. Weeks before the major crisis, a protective case was closed entirely without the mother being notified. Fast forward to July 2024, and her child was removed into state custody on her 8th birthday with absolutely no contact made. The agency allegedly had her current contact info, yet critical notifications were deliberately withheld. The mother only found out late that evening through a third party. The sources argue this tactic effectively strips a parent of their fundamental constitutional ability to advocate for their kid. And it apparently gets darker. According to the documents, this wasn't just about withholding information. The sources allege that agency personnel engaged in a calculated campaign of misrepresentation. They supposedly disseminated malicious falsehoods to the mother's probation officer in Georgia, literally inventing a story about active substance dependence. The documentation claims this was purposefully done to trigger a probation revocation, ultimately trying to terminate her parental rights without due process. The documentation also details how the agency allegedly obstructed medically necessary treatment. They reportedly contacted the mother's physician, misrepresented her case history, and actively interfered with legitimately prescribed medication for diagnosed ADHD. What the sources are arguing here is that you have an agency stepping way outside its bounds, manipulating external medical professionals to construct a false narrative and exert even more institutional control. Section 3. Silencing the most vulnerable. The human cost of institutional control. There's a heartbreaking quote that comes directly from the older daughter in this case. She said, "It's the state. I see it now." Think about that for a second. That demonstrates a profound, first-hand understanding of the systemic issues from a child. According to the sources, this isn't just a kid being rebellious. This is a child making a highly sophisticated diagnosis of institutional betrayal. It perfectly captures the total impotence families feel when they are fighting an unfair system. The agency allegedly silenced the very children it was supposed to protect. The sources outline some incredibly cruel tactics used to coerce compliance. The children's explicit wishes to just go home were ignored. When the older daughter tried to speak up about mistreatment, she was allegedly threatened with having her visitation rights to her own younger sister revoked as a punishment. This level of fear forced the kids to communicate with their mother in hushed tones and quickly destroy written notes out of fear of state reprisal. The sources frame this as an environment of total, suffocating institutional control over the most vulnerable.
So, confronted with this overwhelming trauma and having to watch her children be silenced, the mother asked a really fundamental question. What level of adversity must be endured to elicit action from those empowered to implement change? I mean, must a mother literally stand on the precipice of a bridge to get someone to listen? This question marks the exact pivot in our explainer today. It's the transition from a desperate plea for help to the proactive creation of a computational justice solution.
Which brings us to Section 4, AI as the unbiased listener, a pivot to technological empowerment. You know, the founder's drive to serve the vulnerable wasn't just suddenly forged in family court. It was deeply rooted in her prior experiences providing ministry to the poverty-stricken homeless community in Atlanta, specifically out in Woodrow Wilson Park. The sources indicate this really established her core ethos long before her legal battles began, empowering marginalized populations, those trapped in the poverty scales who were just routinely ignored or cast aside by mainstream society. According to the founder, when she faced her own crisis, every single human system slammed the door in her face. The courts, the lawyers, the agencies, they allegedly refused to even review her recordings or documents, and instead just accused her of lying. So what do? Well, she turned to artificial intelligence. She didn't initially turn to AI to build a business. The documentation states she turned to it because she desperately needed an impartial, unbiased listener to simply validate the undeniable evidence she was holding. The source material highlights a massive dichotomy here. It contrasts the paralyzing bureaucratic inertia of human systems, which the founder claims were totally biased, refused to review evidence, and ignored legal mandates, against the objective, fact-finding mechanics of AI. AI doesn't have an ego. It doesn't have a political agenda. The sources argue it meticulously analyzes thousands of text messages, emails, and audio recordings to uncover obscured truths entirely without judgment. And from that need, the Bella AI module was born. Think of it as an emotionally intelligent, AI-confident companion model. Whether it's empowering a family fighting the child welfare system or someone struggling in the poverty scales of Atlanta, this AI is designed to do something remarkably human. It listens, it understands, and it completely withholds judgment. It doesn't blame the victim. Instead, the sources state it processes complex trauma data to find real, actionable solutions for those discarded by human institutions, rather than just slapping on temporary band-aids. Let's move to our final section, Section 5, Reclaiming Justice Through Tech, Enforcing Institutional Accountability. The founder built this interconnected survival toolkit to securely process overwhelming amounts of evidence. Step 1 is called Smart Doctor. This organizes chaotic trauma data into a coherent narrative so parents don't suffer a nervous breakdown trying to explain themselves. Next, Step 2 is Safe Share. This acts as an ethical gateway, anonymizing sensitive records so that children's identities stay protected. Finally, Step 3 is Copy of Law. This is the AI advocate that meticulously analyzes those secure files to actively expose systemic bias and operational failures. By automating compliance monitoring, this technology creates an immutable accountability audit trail. It literally tracks DCFS worker actions in real time. It instantly flags factual inaccuracies or unsupported claims made by state agents, and it identifies patterns of potential systemic bias. The sources emphasize that it also generates child-friendly legal reports and ensures that defense attorneys actually have an objective, unbiased record of evidence to work from. It basically forces transparency upon a system that is way too accustomed to operating in the dark. But the ultimate goal outlined in the sources goes way beyond just software. The founder mapped her personal trauma directly to mandated legislative solutions to fix the child welfare system nationwide. Every single documented violation, like the denial of information or medical defamation, is paired directly with a proposed statutory reform, such as the Parental Due Process Notification Act and the Child Welfare Case Integrity Act. She took her trauma and turned it into a literal blueprint for systemic accountability. Which brings us to the end of our analysis today. I want to leave you with this provocative thought to chew on. As artificial intelligence continues to expose this vast gap between legal mandates and human bureaucratic failure, how will this new era of computational justice reshape the future of institutional accountability? When our human systems fail, how will we choose to protect our most vulnerable citizens moving forward? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep asking the tough questions.